I'm Susan McElrath. I'm the University Archivist here at American University, and it's my pleasure to tell you about the Peace Corps Community Archives, which started about a year ago. And the goal is to document the experience of individual Peace Corps volunteers. So unlike the National Archives, which documents the actual Peace Corps, the organization, we're actually looking at the experiences of individual volunteers. So we're looking at looking for correspondence, letters, diaries, pictures, oral histories, all kinds of things. There's a small display in the back to give you a sense of some of the materials that we've already received, to give you a taste of what we're looking for. But the goal is to talk about the 2 to 3 years that those of you who are in the Peace Corps were in service in country. So your letters home telling mom and dad what it was like, whether it was good or bad. And sort of so that you can actually get a real sense and taste of what it was really like to be a Peace Corps volunteer. Because ultimately what we want to be able to do is build a collection that is comprehensive both by time and by geography, so that if someone was curious to look at how the Peace Corps experience differed, how education differed from one country to the next over time, you could actually do this sort of comparison by looking at what the experiences were of individual volunteers. We do have a website. There's a sort of postcard in the back with the URL. You come take a look, give you a sort of a sense of what we're doing. We have it's basically a blog with pictures and things talking about collections we've already received. And my card is there too for those of you who have questions about what it is we really want and what the procedures are for donating. So the Kennedy Library right now has narrowed its focus. It's only interested in people who served between 61 and 63. So we take everybody else. So the Kennedy Library, when it first started its project, was accepting all, and they've since had to narrow their scope. So we're basically filling in the gap.
Will you take oral histories?
So we will take copies of oral histories. The oral history program that was started is still based at the Kennedy Library. So those are still going to the Kennedy Library.
They're after 63.
Yes, the oral history program is comprehensive. The actual papers portion is not.
And is this part of the National Archives, or is it American University?
It's American University.
And they fund
Yes.
So the stuff that the Kennedy Library received for after 63, where did it go?
It's staying there. They're just not accepting anything new. So they made it, when they started the project, they had no parameters on what they were accepting. And then someone at some point made a decision that they were going to focus on the Kennedy years. And I asked the question, what does 61 to 63 mean? And the answer is it depends. So you could potentially have someone who started in 63 who would be accepted by the Kennedy Library, or someone who started in 62 who went from 62 to 64. But they want to do this on a case-by-case basis. So if you started in 64, it's a little bit dicier, but they are still collecting those very first groups, but nothing more recent than that.
So if somebody was interested in 1970, they'd have to come here for some of the stuff and go there for other stuff that was received prior to their policy change.
Correct.
And will you be linked in any way?
So that is yes and no. I mean, in the sense that we are sharing information and linking our various websites, but the collections itself, unless they've been digitized and put online, can't really be shared in that sense. And that sort of depends. Though the National Archives would love to digitize those holdings, that's not their top priority at this point. So there's no way to know what and how they're going to decide. And in our case, we have to get permission from the individual donors to digitize materials and put them online. And once we have that, then we'll be building a digital collection or a digital component for the collection. But this is an inherent problem for split collections in all archival repositories. You can link the information about them, but you can't physically link the individual collections. The one thing that we have is, because we're in Washington, D.C., for those researchers who are doing the research in the records of the Peace Corps itself, our location is pretty convenient for them to want to look in both places.
Susan, when you comment on the collection that American has, how it started with the Friends of Columbia,
Okay. So part of the reason why American University was selected as the home for this archives is we basically have the records of the National Peace Corps Association, so we are the official repository of the member group, sort of the big group that you guys are, your umbrella group. And the Friends of Columbia basically was the first group that approached us, and part of the reason for that is our university librarian, Pat Wand, was on the board of the Friends of Columbia and knew that they were looking for a home. And the interesting thing about that collection is it's a combination of an archive of the Friends of Columbia, but also they've been encouraging their individual members to donate. So we've been receiving, since the early 2000s, contributions from individual members of the Friends of Columbia, and that includes some of the ones from the very first group that actually served overseas.
Are you archiving?
Hold on. Can I just ask if the speakers are going to speak to make sure you're speaking into the mic?
Okay. Do you have an archive of the NPCA records
Yes,
from the beginning?
yes.
So if we have material we want to add to that, get it to you?
Yes.
You'll take it?
Yes. If it's a duplicate, we won't keep it. But if we don't have it, yes. But it's almost impossible. That collection is over 100 boxes at this point. So there's no way that I could tell you today whether what you have is actually a duplicate of what we already have. But if we take it, we can review it and analyze it. And then, assuming you're okay with us recycling it if we don't want it, or if you want us to return it to you, we can do that as well.
Do you have newsletters, early newsletters?
We do. I don't know that we have a complete set of all of the early newsletters. So,
Friends of Honduras just published a highlight.
Hold on. I can't hear
Okay.
any of these questions, so we got to have to figure out how to get.
I can repeat
Yeah,
them,
yeah, yeah.
okay?
Friends of Honduras just put together a booklet of about 10 years worth of newsletters, and I can send that to you electronically if you want.
That's fine.
Is that something you would want?
Yes.
Okay. It's not it's our return volunteer, not.
Well, that's as long as in addition to the return volunteers, we are accepting friends groups,
Okay.
and because of the National Peace Corps Association archives, we are also interested in the friends groups and also the regional groups.
Okay, and your contact information's on that card in the
Yeah,
back?
yeah.
Which newsletters are you talking about?
Friends of Honduras.
Oh, okay.
All right, thank you very much.
For RPCV Washington, if we're interested in donating, what would you suggest we do?
I think you guys need to get together as a group and figure out what it is you want to donate, and then figure out a mechanism, whether it's individual people donating to us or going to one of you and then coming to us. It doesn't really matter to me. I just need to know what you decide.
Okay.
So.
And it probably, I mean, in a sense, it would be easier if we could collate.
Yes,
out
it would
duplicates
definitely,
so
yeah.
you don't have to.
Yeah.
So you don't have to do that.
But if that's not possible, then the other way is totally fine.
All right, thank you very much. So I want to first do a quick round of introductions for the panelists so that you have an idea of who they are, and then I'm going to start with, I'm going to launch into some questions. Roger, would you like to start?
You want me to introduce myself?
Yes, yeah.
I'm Roger Landrum. I was a 1961 to 63 volunteer in Nigeria, then went to work at the headquarters. I've been involved in the return volunteer movement, I don't know, for 30 years now. I was an early president of RPCVW. I was a board chairman of the NPCA when it was still the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers. My real career was in national service. I created an organization called Youth Service America, which laid the foundation for AmeriCorps, the National Community Service Act of 1990 and 93. It was a Ford Foundation funded outfit. I did that for about 20 years.
Okay.
I'm Jerry Lutes. I was a volunteer in Panama starting in 1969. They threw Peace Corps out of Panama. I went to the Dominican Republic and finished up in 71. And then in 75, I came to Washington and was involved with the initial activities that led to the creation of RPCVW.
My name is Debby Prigal, and I was a volunteer in Ghana from 81 to 83. I came to Washington right afterwards in 80 and joined RPCV Washington as a member right off the boat. I, some of them remember what I was like then.
I do.
He can't believe that the screaming 23-year-old that he remembers is now 53 and has progressive lenses. I was elected to the board of the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers just right after I got there for 3 years. And then when I came back from graduate school, I was the treasurer of RPCV Washington for 3 years. Got us the 501c3 status if you've ever written a tax-deductible check. I've been the treasurer of Friends of Ghana since about 2003, 2004. And in my day job, I do statistical work for U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services.
Hi, I'm Lisa Martin. I served in Estonia 96 to 98 as an English teacher in a small village just outside of the capital, Tallinn. And I moved to D.C. in January of 99, and almost soon thereafter got involved with the NPCA's planning of the 40th, which turned into the 40+1. I served as the events chair of that event and was recruited onto the RPCVW board by the president then, Dave O'Neill. So I came onto the RPCVW board as president and served 2001 to 2004. And then I also, around that time, I actually did Crisis Corps and Rita Katrina Relief. And what else was Peace Corps related? I've for many years, I've been president of Friends of the Baltics. And I'm very active with the Estonian community, and we'll be going back to sing in their song festival with the Estonian choir this summer. And also, just to give a plug to Partners of the Americas, which is also a JFK-founded organization. I serve on its international board, and I'm also the DC chapter president. So, thanks.
So, for 3 of these board members, I've actually have done individual interviews with them. So, because of that experience, I want to bring out some of what we spoke about in our previous interviews. So, I wanted to start with Roger. And I would like for him to just talk a little bit about the 25th anniversary. This was a very big event that happened in sort of Peace Corps history and helped sort of kick off a number of things.
Okay, let me give just a brief background before I go into that. In 1965, the Peace Corps Agency had a conference here in Washington of returned volunteers, to which about 1,000 people came. And a lot of interesting things happened. There's some documents actually on that. It was the first gathering of RPCVs. But what I wanted to mention to you was that there was an almost unanimous decision at that meeting not to have a national organization of RPCVs, which, thinking how to characterize this, threw a sort of a wet towel on the whole idea of organizing a national network of RPCs for many, many, many years. And the breakthrough came when the group, the sort of historic group in Iowa, formed what was called the National Council of RPCVs in, I don't know, something like 1979 or 80. And that's also when one of those people, or several of those people who were involved in that, had the first meetings of RPCVW. And that was that little bit of history is very important because it was a beachhead for something which had been stalled for such a long period of time. By the way, I stay in touch with people at AmeriCorps, and they came to see me at one point to say, how come Returned Peace Corps volunteers have such active alumni and we can't get our alumni to do anything? And I laughed and said, well, look, it took 25 years. People have their lives to restart when they come back to the country and after they've been a volunteer, even in Vista or AmeriCorps. So don't expect it to happen overnight. I mean, people have to sort of get to mid-career before conditions are really right for doing this. So it wasn't all the fact that people voted it against it in 1965, it was just partly the natural course of things. But at any rate, there were some of us here in Washington. We had a wonderful steering committee for several years. It was one of the best groups I've ever worked with in my entire career. And we were able to really develop some very, very dynamic programming, have some influence on Capitol Hill, where I had worked and some other RPCVs had worked. I could tell you all that, but I want to go to the 25th because a very interesting thing happened while I was president of RPCVW. Jerry will remember this. The 25th anniversary came around, and the steering committee of RPCVW said, would you go to Lorette Ruppy, the director of the Peace Corps, and see if we could work with them on planning a 25th anniversary event. So I did that. And I was told in no uncertain terms there would be no event in Washington. It was sort of a funny reaction from Lorette Ruppy, who's a big hero of the Peace Corps. So I said, well, what's this all about? She says, well, the Reagan at the White House is convinced that if you bring a lot of return volunteers to Washington, they will demonstrate against President Reagan. And therefore, we're not going to have an event in Washington, we're going to have them around the country. So I came back to the steering committee, reported this, and everybody said, bullshit, let's just do it ourselves. So what we did was put together a coalition. There were very few existing groups at the time, country of service groups or regional groups, and there were some other types of groups. But we put together a coalition of 4 organizations that were willing to put in $1,000 each to kick off organizing a 25th anniversary event in Washington, not knowing where it would lead. I mean, it's a big challenge to undertake on a volunteer basis, I'll put it that way. So we had this $4,000 to start with, and then something really interesting happened. The MacArthur Foundation heard that the Reagan administration did not want a return volunteer Peace Corps anniversary in Washington, and they sent us a check for $25,000 to organize the event. The key person in that was Harris Wofford, who knew a board member at the MacArthur Foundation, and told him the story, and that MacArthur Foundation board member got the grant. And I will forever remember we had a mailbox in Cleveland Park where we got donations and all of our correspondence. And I went to that box one day and opened it up, and there was a check for $25,000. So I came back to the steering committee and said, wow, we got $25,000, what do we do now? So what we did is we began hiring staff and put together a planning group. And to make a long story sort of short, the whole thing gelled very, very quickly. We began sending out notices, and people began registering. And we had registration fees, and we began gathering a lot of money from that. And began planning the program. And the key person, you won't be surprised to hear this, the key person to help us do the really big things was Senator Teddy Kennedy, who obviously had a real interest in this. And in the absence of the Peace Corps running interference for us, Senator Kennedy's office arranged for us to get permission to use conference rooms on the mall, and, for example, to get Corazon Aquino, the recently hero who'd been elected president of the Philippines, to be the keynote speaker. Senator Kennedy was just an enormous help to all this, and people began registering by the thousands from all over the country. So pretty soon, I mean, we had well over $100,000 to begin planning with, and a lot of very interesting things happened. We figured out, well, how can we do this? At the time, you know, the place where the Native American Museum is on the mall was an empty space, and we figured that that's where we could do it. We got permission to do that through Senator Kennedy, and we got a circus tent, which we ordered from California, which the rent of the tent and facilities was $63,000. But we did it, and we needed it because in the end we had between 4,000 and 5,000 people come to Washington for the event. And just call time if I'm talking too long about this. But to put it sort of in very short terms, the thing just kind of exploded. We got tremendous national publicity, national television coverage, people interviewed in the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And the Peace Corps, this is one of the really good things about Lorette Rupe. She was able then to convince the Reagan administration that this was going to happen whether they wanted it or not, and if they better let her get involved to make sure it was peaceful. So the Peace Corps then came on board with the event so that we had a kind of a unity around the final arrangement of the thing. Sergeant Shriver came and gave a remarkable speech, which many people remember for his serve, serve, serve admonition to everybody. It was just a glorious event. And our steering committee for the event kind of featured the return volunteer groups that existed around the country and the country of service groups. And in the wake of the event, those groups multiplied exponentially. It went from like 5 country of service groups to like 25, and regional groups started everywhere. The membership of the National Council began to increase. Our local membership increased to over 200 as a result of that. Well, we also set an agenda for the RPC movement and a goal of 10,000 members for the national organization. And we sort of really believe that return volunteers could have a big impact, not only on like Peace Corps budgeting, lobbying and stuff, but on foreign affairs in the countries where we had served. We were very intent on having a national impact on American foreign policy. But what happened immediately was we made a profit of some, I don't know, maybe like $75,000 or so from the conference. And I remember these I went to meet with the board of the NP, the National Council of Return Peace Corps Volunteers, which had a very anti-Washington bias. And the negotiation was, we'll turn over the profits to you if you hire a paid staff, so it becomes a real organization, not just a volunteer group with a real program, and you move the headquarters to Washington so we can have a presence here in Washington for political and other reasons. And they saw the writing on the wall that if they didn't do it, that we would turn the money, use the money to form another national organization, because we knew what we wanted to do in terms of the RPC movement. So they agreed to do it, and we were able to use the money to hire the first NPCA staff. First director was Tim Carroll, who immediately hired like 4 or 5 people to form the headquarters here in Washington. And the membership of the National Council of Return Peace Corps Volunteers then began growing. RPCVW was larger in members in membership at this time than the National Council was. But the National Council exploded after that, and pretty soon it was up to like, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 members.
Right. Thank you. And I also wanted to ask you to speak maybe briefly about some of the efforts that you had on the Hill. I know there were some recommendations that
Yes, there is.
RPCVW came
I
into.
brought a couple copies of, we created a document called Peace Corps 1985 Meeting the Challenge. And it had in it 5 recommendations, which were set a goal of 10,000 volunteers in service with increased representation in South America and Asia, establish Goal 3 of the Peace Corps Act as the central mission of the agency, remove appointment of Peace Corps country directors from the political patronage system, appoint a qualified return Peace Corps volunteer as the next Peace Corps director following the tenure of Lorette Rupe, and create a special committee of return Peace Corps volunteers to advise the director on operational improvements in the Peace Corps. I had been on the staff of Senator Alan Cranston, who was the second in command of the Senate during this period. And there was another RPC named Matthew Casalato, who was a close top aide to the Speaker of the House. So that we had really good connections on the Hill. And we took these we circulated the copies of this to every member of Congress, and we took the recommendations to Cranston and to Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, and 3 of the recommendations were passed, including removing the country directors from the patronage system, which was incredibly important because at the time, it was hit and miss. Some country directors were fine, but a lot of them were political hacks who were being paid off by whoever happened to be president and were terrible in their jobs overseas. So we got that, again, removed from the political patronage system. And again, Lorette Ruby was very helpful in that she could have stopped it, but she did not oppose removing it from the patronage system. She got the Reagan administration to agree to it. So it was signed into law. These three things were signed into law by President Reagan, including the 10,000 person goal and making the third goal a central part of the agency mission. What we did at this time, we would look for leverage points of where we could get something very practical and important done, where we had key RPCVs. And in that case, we had me with access to Senator Cranston and Matthew Castellato in the Speaker's office. But we also had very strong RPCVs in law firms. Like there was a guy named Tom McGrew, I don't know if you guys remember him, who was a very high-powered RPCV lawyer in a big law firm here. Who had a lot of lobbying.
He was a partner at Arnold and Porter.
He had a lot of lobbying experience, and we put him in charge of lobbying on the Peace Corps budget. And he was tremendously effective in reversing declines in the Peace Corps budget and getting some increases. So the strategy, I mean, these things are fairly obvious now, but the strategy was to find the leverage points for getting this stuff done. And again, because the National Council of RPCVs was in Iowa, they were not of any use in any of this. I mean, it had to really be done here in Washington again. So we turned over all these activities to the NPCA once they came here to Washington.
Right.
But we were a very effective lobbying group for several years.
All right, thank you very much.
If some of you want to see what these recommendations were like, here's the thing we sent out to Congress.
All right.
Yeah, just circulated.
All right, now I'd just like to move on to Jerry and ask you to just describe some of the regular activities that RPCVW was doing during the 80s, like on a sort of more regular basis.
Can you get the mic?
Well, the activities, I think, started off pretty wimpy when we were just getting started, but they picked up stamina. I'd say in our first year it was mostly social events, happy hours. The structure of the organization at the very beginning was to be a committee of committees. And so there was one group that was supposed to be doing community service activities. There was another group that was supposed to focus on cross-cultural events. And I think we had potluck dinners where people would bring food representative of where they had served. We had another group that was focusing on issues and social activities. Social seemed to be what we could do best. Drinking was pretty much the theme of the first year. But about 2 years into our floundering around without a president, where we tried to have a rotating presidency and a recipe for a weak organization, we changed in, I think, probably 1981 to have a more normal set of officers. And Karen Kiefer put in a lot of energy, and much of her energy went into organizing issue fora or events. And I have a recollection of a meeting on infant formula with speakers who had been basically investigative reporters reporting how Nestle had induced women to use infant formula instead of breast milk throughout Latin America as a marketing ploy, and then their breasts dried up, and so they were hooked. They had to use infant formula. That was the only option. And To this day, I don't buy Nestle products because of that event. And at the end of the event, then it's kind of a extra. There was a fellow who wanted to talk to us about cancer and how he had survived testicular cancer and was going to make spread his message to the world by competing in sporting events like bike riding. That was Lance Armstrong. We had another issue forum on immigration right at the height of the battles under the Reagan administration. And by this time, we used the secret Peace Corps handshake. We were able to attract important people in Washington because of having well-connected RPCVs. I remember another one, and I can only assume it was about the fighting in Yugoslavia, in which Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and Senator Dodd were speakers. So we rather quickly ratcheted up from a bunch of us looking at each other over beer to having some very impressive events that drew people in. I would say the community service, which was supposed to be my responsibility, pretty much atrophied. We never did much in the way of community service events.
Remember we did the volunteer income tax?
We did the volunteer income tax, but that wasn't, I don't think, a result of the Community Service Committee. This was my getting referred to, when I first came to Washington, by a predecessor organization or another organization, the Independent Foundation, had a skills bank. And when I first came to Washington in 1975, I started looking for a way to volunteer. And Patrick Sakamunde, volunteer from Thailand, was basically running the chapter of the Independent Foundation here in Washington, which has since gone extinct, and suggested that I work with an organization that did that volunteer tax assistance. And then I was able to put it in the newsletter and suck in other people. But as an official committee function, I don't think that qualifies. One of the other activities I remember from those early years, probably our first year, was we went and saw some Peace Corps recruiting movies. And I have a recollection of a movie featuring Roger sitting in a tree, having a dialogue with Nigerians on the ground, talking about the philosophy of Americans being in Nigeria or something like that. I can't remember the substance. I can just remember Roger in the tree.
The Nigerians said that we were still seeking the frontier, except now we were seeking it in Nigeria.
Of course, another thing that had its start in those early years was the annual wreath-laying ceremony.
Yeah, we still do that.
Yes. And then because of our philosophy of being a committee of committees in the beginning days, and that kind of stuck with us, it was like, we'll provide a framework and you guys go off and do your own thing. A group of volunteers got very interested in U.S. policy toward Central America, and particularly the support we were giving to the repressive regimes in El Salvador and Nicaragua in the name of fighting communism. And they kind of, RPCVW provided like the incubator for them forming their own little group that wrote the book Voices of Experience in Central America, that was presenting their view as former Peace Corps volunteers from Central America on how much harm this was doing to the U.S. And think there is one other event. Roger is a visionary and an expert delegator. One of his visions was that we should have annual trips to exotic places, and our members would go along. So he called my wife, Marcia, and
Who you met at RPCV Washington, correct?
oh yes, the guy who said I'm here for community service, not social, found my wife on the through the steering committee. Persuaded her to organize a trip to Kenya for the RPCV. You know, it would be a group trip, so it would be congenial and it would have reduced airfare. So as the trip turned out, it was me, Marcia, Marcia's mother, my father, a friend of Marcia's from her college days who was a volunteer but lived off in Ohio, or, you know, didn't have any connection to RPCVW. And then,
Alice.
huh?
Alice Alexander.
Yes, and then I think 2 or maybe 3 RPCVW members who wanted no part of any itinerary. They were looking for the cheap airfare. We saw them on the plane going over, we saw them on the plane coming back, and that was it. And that was the last travel adventure. But now NPCA is doing it, so it wasn't that it was a bad idea, it was just that Roger was ahead of his time.
Thank you very much. Gloria, I know you were involved and treasurer during the time that we got incorporated into a formal 501c3 nonprofit organization. So I would like you to speak a little bit about how that came about.
Okay, just a little bit. When I first got back in '83, my first Peace Corps event, I found out about RPCV Washington because I had come down to look for a job and I had gone to the Peace Corps office and stuff. And the first event I went to was something on Capitol Hill where Tom McGrew was moderating, and he talked about how Peace Corps had taken over aid, that half of all Peace Corps volunteers were former aid volunteers, how they had taken over Save the Children. He named everything else. And then I got up and said, Peace Corps has taken over aid, Save the Children, World Wildlife Fund, all of these. But one thing Peace Corps hasn't taken over is Peace Corps. And I started to talk about the political appointee that we had who was about the worst one, never been in Africa, never been anything, and said point blank that if a volunteer was killed in service, he would order a coffin. And that was his entire responsibility, and said that was his responsibility as director and as a human. He really didn't care if one human being to another if people were killed.
Was that Dick Celeste?
What?
Was that Dick Celeste?
No. This was Willie Gonzalez, who was Peace Corps Ghana director.
Oh.
No, not up at that level. This was the guy who was actually in country, and this is before internet or email or anything like that. The only way that you could complain to headquarters was to ET to terminate and go back. And so I got up there and said, but Peace Corps hasn't taken over Peace Corps, and there was this whole cheers. And that was one of the things that went into that. When I first came, it was a very different organization. I was one of the few recently returned people. It was mostly people who had been out for a while, and that was very helpful to me as somebody who was new to get connections getting established in Washington. And I may say one of the things that bothers me a lot about RPCV Washington now is that it's mostly people who are recently back. And that's great for them, and there's nothing wrong with people who are recently back, of course, but people like me who have been there a while can feel out of place. And also, I think the recently returned people could really benefit from having more established people who can help you find jobs, who can help you get oriented, things like that. It's very helpful for me. I was idealistic. I joined I was the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers and was elected to the board and wound up with all these bureaucrats wherever. And it was sort of a little bit of a joke because RPCV Washington was a very innovative organization working hard, and the National Council sat around and had meetings and meetings and meetings, and Holland McKenna said 2 years is a short amount of time for them to get something done. So there was a big rivalry. When I moved back I was in Chicago business school. When I moved back, I had a job in Washington, and I had my MBA in finance and statistics, and I said, you know, I think I'd like to be treasurer, and I was moving back, and I became what I believe was the first person to run for an RPCV Washington office who was not a resident of the area and was planning to move back, and they said, we'll take you anyway, and I'd been paying my dues. So by this time, the organization was not quite the seat of the pants organization that it had been. It had been established with officers, and you had a past president, and it was a bit established. You know, every year we went to the Kennedy gravesite. We had a speakers bureau that had something every other month. There was a fairly regular newsletter. You know, it was a fun place to be, but it was established. The meetings were, you know, the first Wednesday night of every month, held at a place. So, you know, it was there. So in the days before Lotus, before Excel, before Lotus, for those of you who may not have heard of it, got down with my little calculator, the HP 12C calculator, and wrote up everything and redid it. That's the way it was. It was all, you know, there. And then my contribution to RPCV Washington started the day I got home, and there was a letter from the Internal Revenue Service. Because my name was on the checking account, since I was authorized to write checks, and I was the one who got the statements. And it was made out to Agua, which I had never heard of, AAAGW, saying, we don't have any records of your taxes paid or whatever. And in my normal, very calm self went crazy, calling up people, oh my God, what's this Agua? And it was apparently the Action Alumni Association of Greater Washington had been some name way back when, and we had never incorporated. We were not a 501c3. We had all they had was a checking account. So I go absolutely crazy, and we figure, oh my God, what's wrong? And we enlisted the help of June Gerteg, who was a RPCV from Uganda in the late 60s and was a partner at Freed, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson. Shriver as in Sergeant Shriver, who agreed to take us on a pro bono basis, and we applied for 501c3 status as a charity, and then we got some 501c4 status going back. And basically, we're sort of pleading nitwit status. The reason that we didn't apply for it before is because we didn't know anything beforehand, which is true. And they were she said, can you file the papers for us? And she said, you can't have a major law firm file papers and then plead nitwit status that you don't know what you're doing. So they filled it out, and then I signed it. And they filled it out honestly, they just made it. If I may answer, we had to give the number of employees, the top 5 employees who earned over $60,000 a year. We had to provide their salaries and names, as is per IRS regulations. We said we're all volunteers. We were asked to list assets. We were asked to list the balance sheet. We showed our assets were a food cooler at $20. Office supplies at $30, a felt banner at $10, and 2 food plates at $5. We had assets of $65 was there. And there were all kinds of others about the expenses, and there was, $300 to the Friends of Kenya for mailing, and all kinds of other cute little things that come down. Sale of mailing labels and cookbooks was $412.10, and we got it going. So we got it. We got our 501c3. We got our 401c3, and then we were an incorporated group. So with that, after 3 years, I handed it over to the next person, and while have not held office at RPCV Washington, have still come to events. And I would say one friend who I hosted the first RPCV Washington event I had ever gone to came to my wedding 25 years later. So there's a lot to be said for what RPCV Washington can give.
That was David Hunsberger.
Yes, that was David Hunsberger. Terry was also at my wedding. I think I met you a bit later, though. It wasn't.
David was president at that time, I think.
Helen McKenna was president, I think. Yes. There were a lot. And David was president, then he became treasurer, then he became back again. I mean, there were a lot of the same people, and it was sort of a we can do it kind of attitude.
Great. Thank you very much. Lisa, would you be able to please talk about the 40+1 events and
Okay.
how RPCVW was involved.
Okay. Well, I wanted to clear up. There's some confusion too. I think because RPCVW was more deeply involved in the 50th, NPCA relied on their help more this time around due to funding, I believe. Back in the planning of the 40th, which was to happen a few days after 9/11, so it was postponed till the following June. At that time, there was just a volunteer committee independent of RPCVW. I was not yet on the board of RPCVW, but I had a major role in the planning of the 40+1 and was also planning the 40th. I was the events chair. And so I was at the time in grad school here at AU doing a master's in performing arts management, so I was in charge of anything to do with performance or arts stuff. So so it was, just about 2 weeks before, or less than 2 weeks away, and I was actually in New York on 9/11 with my parents visiting relatives. We went up the night before for a wedding and got stuck on Staten Island with my cousin, Father Vinny. And after 9/11, it was just a lot of panic of calls, like back to headquarters. MPCA headquarters with the planning committee, like, are we going to do it? And I wanted to move forward. I'm like, we should still just do it anyway. And but the Kennedy Shriver family were the ones who really, discouraged us from just said to hold off, and they wouldn't attend. And so much was so unknown. And even coming back to DC after being in New York, it was actually more stressful here because tanks on the street. I live right in downtown myself. And we had planned events at DAR Constitution Hall, ceremony there. And I had planned a all-day festival on the National Mall. We had been meeting with the Park Service, and we have been working on this for years, really. I had been involved maybe a year and a half by that point, and I had planned a all-day performance or 2-day. I can't remember for the original 40th. It was going to be on the stage right below near the Washington Monument. This is it called the Sylvan Stage? Yeah, Sylvan Theater. Yeah. And I had secured bands from even New York and Boston to come down, and had to cancel. And but then I invited them back. So when we regrouped and we decided to do it away from the mall, and it was going to be based at the Omni Showroom, which didn't sound as exciting to me as being on the National Mall, but it was just more contained that way. And so then I thought, well, let's have an activity at the National Zoo since it's right nearby. And so I coined it Zoo Fest, and had 2 days of performances at the zoo. I got Marco Werman from The World, PRI, because he's an RPCV. He was our MC, and co-MC was a good friend of mine who passed. He was killed in India a few years ago, Brent Hurd, who served in Bulgaria. And he wore his Bulgarian traditional garb, and he was very charismatic. And we had the Silk Road Dance Company perform. I had the Ukrainian folk ensemble Cheris. I had other Indian dance, and Richard Miller and Patrick DeSantos, Brazilian music. Just an array of music on the stage. And then up the hill at the center for the National Zoo, we had all day film and lecture events with Joseph Apala, who served in Sierra Leone and is an expert on the Gullah and their connection. Some of you know who Joe Apala is. He's great. He lived in Sierra Leone 30 years or something. I had Mike Tidwell speak. He's an environmentalist here locally, RPCV, and some other speakers. And so that was a great event in and of itself, the Zoo Fest. Meanwhile, all the conference activities were going on at the Omni Showroom. And then I don't think I slept that weekend. It was exhausting. Fortunately, I was younger back then. yeah, there was the big event on Saturday night. How many of you were there? Yeah. Okay. So, huh?
That was a Mayflower. Oh, the Shore.
Shoreham, Omni Shoreham. Yeah, and we had Sarge speaking.
Motorcycle.
And the motorcycle, which I had forgotten about, but I was Googling photos from that. It was almost impossible to find any photos from that night because I don't have access to my photos right now. Well, I was in charge of all the performers, and I had gotten Concron West African Dance Troupe, and there were about 30 dancers, including some. They had kids. They were all backstage, and the speakers were delayed. Like, I think that. Am I mistaken? Wasn't it delayed like 4 hours? It was some crazy delay. Do any of you remember? It was so delayed, and everybody backstage. I was having to calm people down, and we had Cheris, the Ukrainian guys, performing, and Silk Road Dance Company, in their Central Asian, flowing gowns, doing belly dance and stuff, and. So it was a little chaotic because everybody wanted to leave. They were hungry, and they got paid for those. Those performances were not pro bono, and I don't know. There were so many speakers scheduled, which I had nothing to do with the speakers, but they just kept going on. And finally, Sarge came on, and he was the finale, and he was the highlight of the night. He came out, as Terry reminds us, he drove out in a Harley Davidson on a bike and wearing sunglasses. It was fun. And right after he was to be done, Concron was supposed to burst on the stage and start dancing. And I was on the perimeter watching, and Maria Shriver was there with like her 4 youngest kids, and she was about to leave, and I said, "Oh, you guys might want to stay because there's going to be some cool dance, African dance," and so they did, and they really enjoyed it, and then so all those performers had performed throughout the evening, and then the finale, there was an after party too with Afro. I hired Afro pop. Do you know? To DJ Georges Collinet, who's from West Africa. He's a famous West African DJ. They're based in New York, but Afro pop. So they play all the different West African music, and so it was a really good party. I think there were over 1,000 people dancing. There were 1,000 that actually attended the sit-down gala, and then there were more that came into the after party because it was quite expensive, so not everybody attended the sit-down, but yeah, so that was the 40 plus one that ended up happening, and I think it was a fun time. Yeah.
Just an editorial comment. That's the night that Shriver got Alzheimer's.
That was the night. I didn't really want to say.
Maria had to step up and ask him to sit down.
Yeah, that was the first sign he publicly showed signs of having dementia, and
And I think the last time he came to any RPCV function.
Right.
It was.
Came the next day.
Well, but I mean, that weekend was yeah, it was obvious then that he was starting. It was very sad.
After that,
I think some people were confused too, or didn't know yet. But yeah, it. So that's the point.
Lisa,
Mm-hmm.
when you were president for 3 years,
Yeah.
you started the performances at embassies.
That was separate from. RPCVW was doing when I was president, we were doing the partnership events at embassies, which didn't usually have performances. It was just like a party, and we did fundraiser for Peace Corps partnership projects. And we did those annually. We did Costa Rica and, oh God, I can't remember. Sorry? Well, what grew out of that, I talked to Dane Smith at the time. I said, let's start an embassies program for MPCA, and I started doing it as a consultant. And so we did Morocco, Uzbekistan, Philippines. But then when NPCA changed with Kevin Quigley, he didn't want to continue any kind of, I guess it was perceived that there was preferential treatment being given to the DC group rather than, and focus more just on what would bring in. It wasn't really making the money. It wasn't costing money, but it wasn't bringing money in worth doing. So I understand that now that I'm an executive director of a nonprofit. So, Gloria was an active attendee too. I think Terry and Debbie at all our RPCVW events. But RPCVW itself was very active under my reign. And, we had, I think we kind of peaked during that time. It had been kind of slow, and then we were up to like 5 to 6 events a month. We had cooking with Chef Kyle. I think all the women attended that, for if you knew who Chef Kyle was. And, I knew how to identify people that would attract attendees. And we had speakers bureau events like Gaddy Vasquez, who is director of Peace Corps. I want to stress to you how kind he was and generous of his time with RPCVW, more than probably any Peace Corps director, at least in recent history. So, people want to criticize him just because he was a Republican, but he and I bonded too because we were both kind of new to DC and we were both from Southern California. And but he was really great and attended our events. And we also did an annual thing with Jody Olson, who was the deputy director of Peace Corps, and it was at Buffalo Billiards. So, it was billiards with Jody Olson kind of event. It was well attended also. So.
Thank you very much. I've got a few questions.
Just mention 2 things that were not mentioned at all. I think
Okay.
pretty significant. Roger started off with the 25th anniversary, but there was actually a 20th anniversary there was a 20th anniversary event at Howard University, and I had just returned from Peace Corps. I finished up in December, traveled in South America, and I got home, and there was this thing the week after I returned home, and that was, I don't know if it was a whole week, but it was several days at Howard University. And then,
But I think that RPCVW had no involvement with that. I think that was Peace Corps celebrating its 20 years.
RPCVW was, or whatever it was around.
It did have some involvement.
Yeah, it was around the.
Claims she organized it.
Who was?
Karen.
Right,
Kiefer,
Karen
yeah.
Kiefer did it, right, that's right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing about that, right around the same time, was that RPCVW, I was at law school starting in '82, and RPCVW was meeting here on the AU campus at the School of International Studies. That's actually where I met Debbie. That was on the AU campus. So we're sort of coming full circle here.
All right. Thank you very much. So I got a few questions I want to ask all of you to just answer briefly. Some of these are been questions I've asked you before. I just want you to just speak briefly to how you first got involved with RPCVW. Some of you have already sort of mentioned that already, but if you haven't, it would just be nice to state how you first came across the organization.
In 1965, the Peace Corps hired a former volunteer, who was in my group in Nigeria named David Shickley, to make a documentary film to be used for recruiting for the Peace Corps. That was the film that has me in the tree. The format was, I went back to Nigeria to visit 4 of my former students unannounced. And the film shows the reunion with the 4 students and sort of their current lives and what influence having a Peace Corps teacher had on them. We went back to their home villages. It's a fun film in general. But Karen Kiefer invited me to come to RPCVW to show the film and to talk about the making of the film. That was my first involvement.
Well, mine was the getting invited to the large meeting of RPCVs in the area that was to discuss whether to organize a group in the Washington, D.C. area a fellow that I had been, was in my training group in Peace Corps and I was with in Panama, was one of the 3 former volunteers who decided that it would be a good thing to organize a group of returned volunteers in the Washington area, and who were successful in getting Peace Corps to either give them the names and addresses of the volunteers they knew about, or collaborating with them by sending out letters to the Peace Corps. I don't know how they did it, but I didn't get any of that kind of official notification. I just got a phone call from my buddy, who I hadn't seen since Peace Corps days, and I showed up at the meeting, and so the meeting agreed there should be a group. There was about 100 people there, so there was actually not a lot of agreement, but there was a sense that they were willing to go along with the formation of a group, and then there was an activity of figuring out what do people want from an organization, a process that probably continues to this day. But we identified several different activities, like the cross-cultural and the community service and the social activities, and so right off the bat I was on the community service committee, and so a member of the steering committee, and migrated from there to treasurer, and then I think left.
I was back off the boat using the RPCV office, and not RPCV, there was a place for recently returned volunteers where you could make phone calls. I was looking for a job, and from there, heard about the SCOTA organization, went to an event.
Now that I'm thinking back to that moment when the then president, Dave O'Neill, was encouraging me, I think we were at the Omnishorum planning, so that would have been in 2002. So I may have not become president till 2002, but I was president for 3 years. So maybe it was 2002 to 2005. But yeah, I don't think there was anyone willing to run, and he thought I had the skill set to take it over, and I thought, well, it was something I was interested in. I was very passionate about Peace Corps, and we were going to be wrapping up the conference anyway, and I would have the time. So, and I also, just echoing what others, I think Debbie mentioned, or was it Terry, that RPCVW really needs to recruit a diverse board, diversity of eras, ages and eras. And you have to make a concerted effort to do that. I did the best I could, but also in the activity planning, and because sometimes I've observed, I felt like RPCVW was turning into more just a happy hour for kids, kind of. Sorry, you guys become kids when I get to be this age, but it's. So I don't even attend RPCVW events anymore, and I used to attend, virtually all of our events, 5 to 6 a month. And, I would like to get back involved, but I don't know, so.
Thank you. I'd also like to ask all of you guys, how does knowing if someone else is a returned Peace Corps volunteer affect how you view them as a person? I guess anyone wants to read?
It's an interesting question, and I think it brings out more the issue of did everybody really enjoy their Peace Corps service? I think one of the issues with all the returned Peace Corps groups is that we all talk to each other, and we're all the people who think Peace Corps was the greatest thing we ever did, and we all talk to each other, and we forget about the fact that we're a very self-selected group. Peace Corps has in its brochure that some survey showed that 98% of all Peace Corps volunteers said they would do it again. There's no way, given that a third of the place quits, early, and an awful lot of people stay around because they're not happy. It's you know, you go to a Peace Corps conference and you ask people who have flown across the country to go to a Peace Corps conference, would you do it again? And the answer is 98%. So I feel when I meet Peace Corps volunteers at Peace Corps event, obviously there's a real thing. When I find out somebody was a Peace Corps volunteer, I immediately feel a certain kinship with them, but it doesn't always last. We're a very diverse group. I mean, Nixon ordered the tapes, the records of the return of Peace Corps volunteers destroyed because he was afraid that Peace Corps volunteers were going to rise up against him. The guy was paranoid. Anybody who knows Peace Corps volunteers knows you're never going to get them all to agree on something and go to you're never going to get us all to go and lobby in one direction or another. So, yes, I feel something in the beginning when I'm at Peace Corps things I do. But to be honest with you, there's an awful lot of Peace Corps people who went and who didn't really feel that it was some wonderful life-changing event. Maybe they left early because they were unhappy. Maybe they stayed because they felt they made a commitment. But it's not always there. And just because two people who returned Peace Corps volunteers doesn't mean you're going to be good friends. It doesn't mean you're going to have a strong bond. Lynn, what was her name? She was the head of the National Lynn, not Lynn.
Randall?
Was she the one? She was the head of the, no.
Of the NPCA?
Yeah. Well, I remember she was there for 2 years, a couple of years as the head, and then she said, but the real truth is, it just isn't enough. It can't be the only thing that you have in common with somebody.
I don't know. I agree and I don't. I mean, there was a time when I only wanted to hang around RPCVs and I wasn't interested in other people. But then I think I had an overdose and I began to realize they're so predictable, especially during an election cycle. And, I think you also have to consider diversity of perspective and go beyond right and left, maybe forward and up rather than just right or left. Sorry, that's my politics. And because I didn't comply, it's interesting. I didn't support Obama in the last election, but I was invited. I was a Hillary person. And then I woke up and realized that Democrats and Republicans are the same. And I was invited to march. I was given a VIP position in the inaugural parade and by RPCVW. And I declined at first, but then they encouraged me to just consider, and more for historical reasons and representing RPCVW. So there were like 200 of us there marching, and I got really into it, and I was blowing kisses at Mrs. Obama, and I remember, I was the one who ended up in the news. Like the photo of me, I think, was the most prominent, like on McNeil-Lehrer report, and so it was kind of funny because like a lot of RPCVs at the time thought I was a Republican but I was more like, anti-establishment than anything. So, but yeah, and I had pneumonia that day. It was like 17 degrees. How many of you were at that inauguration? How many of you did any of you march? You were marching? Yeah, I was very happy to carry the Estonian flag. But, we all rewrite history too. When I served in Peace Corps, I complained about Estonia more than anyone. But I love Estonia now, and it has a special place in my heart, and so it's also a matter of how you perceive the world and look back on your life. And but I think, like Debbie said, I'm always surprised when people don't consider their Peace Corps experience a pivotal time in their life. So I think that's our commonality.
Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I'd be curious what your answer to it is too. For me, I had kind of mixed feelings. When I was very active in RPCVW and in the NPCA, I thought RPCVs could be a really big influence on American foreign policy. And although in some ways with the 25th and other things, we achieved more than I could reasonably have expected in terms of developing the organization and stuff, it was all very disappointing to me that there wasn't more impact and that so much frequently it lapsed back into just being sort of happy hours. So I have very mixed feelings about that. And in terms of RPCVs, I had a wonderful experience with RPCVW. It was David Hunsberger and Jeff Drumter and Jerry and others were a delight to work with, and I think very, very effective. The NPCA was a nightmare to work with. Just a nightmare. It was like
Joke.
It was worse than herding cats. They were naysayers about everything. You had to fight to try to do anything. And this went on for years and years and years. And I finally realized it was all just an ownership fight by the Iowa group. They didn't want anybody else to have any role in the whole thing. But there was a lot of trouble with the NPCA board for a very long time. It was very unprofessional and was sort of very franky-dink about stuff. I think it's begun to climb out of that in terms of finding an important common agenda, and I hope that Glenn Burkhart will be able to have a more positive impact on it all. So I mean, it doesn't exactly answer your question, but it's a very mixed kind of experience. I think Debbie's right, you have to realize if there is something in common, you've got to really search to find it.
I could just add, you have a lot in common with a lot of RPVs, and I bond with many RPCVs much more quickly than I do with the average person. You take who's on a metro train, and if there's an RPCV there, there's a good chance I'm going to bond with them a lot faster. But it's not true all the time.
And it's been, I mean, I know Shriver fairly well, and also Harris Wofford, and always very big in their vision for the Peace Corps was a very organized force of returned Peace Corps volunteers and a big influence. And I do think that, I mean, we have had a lot of influence, in things like the Foreign Service and sort of informally, just by the professions people have followed and our impact on foreign aid and so on, not in an organized way, in an informal way. But the organized part of it has been very, very iffy, I think.
I think a lot of the difference that Peace Corps volunteers makes is what they do on an individual basis. And other than lobbying for a larger Peace Corps, I'm not so sure we really could agree on what we think is a better foreign policy for many people. I mean, some people feel strongly in one way, some feel strongly in another.
Yeah.
But
I don't know. I just don't think it's our role to, I think we should focus on the 3 goals and on the 3rd goal of bringing the world back home rather than really being so political, because we could be wrong. We could be encouraging something that is wrong. We find out later is wrong. So I would just caution our community from getting too politically involved and entrenched, and just raise awareness about the rest of the world in other ways.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up now for some questions, if some people would like to ask some questions. Okay. Hold on.
Probably this is to you, Roger. I worked at Peace Corps in 65 to 66 and then went in as a volunteer and came back to Washington. There was an effort that I was involved in, this has totally left my memory, to organize a local group that was very informal. And I was wondering if I can't even remember who was involved in, but I used to run into you. We don't know each other, but in those early days, your name was a big name of an RPCV out there. And I remember we got together, someone offered their house on Capitol Hill. I can picture the front porch, and a huge number of people came out. I mean, we took over the whole block and everything. And we tried, and of course it was a big party, right? Lots of beer and everything. And I'm trying to remember when it was. So I came back in 68, and then left again, and then came back for a little bit, and then went to graduate school in Ann Arbor for 4 or 5 years. So sometime when I was in Washington during those times, and I remember that there was, and I've talked to some people about this who were returned during that time, there was a real negativity about forming as a group. Some of it, I think, was a bit of an embarrassment then, because we were seen as these, noble people who went out and lived in grass huts and all of that. And people, you come back and you're given 2 minutes to say what you've done, and then they talk about whatever, like O.J. Simpson trial or whatever one's going on now. And some of it, of course, was our difficulty, as you had mentioned, because Nixon had destroyed the directories of all the people, so we couldn't find each other easily. But some of it was the Vietnam War was so important to us. Many of the volunteers who served I served 66 to 68, which was really not only the high point of number of volunteers serving, but also the number of people that were using it to get out of the draft, which was my entire group. There was a lot of negativity towards government and federal government and having anything to do with it, and of course who the presidents were at the time, and so there was, it just died on the vine. And it would have been a great opportunity to pull people together in Washington. I mean, we're talking about this as Washington. We weren't even talking national at the time. But it just died and people showed up, and if it was all parties, they might come all the time. But there was just no interest in doing that at all and there are probably 10 other reasons that I can't even think about or remember. But I was, and I mean, if anybody has heard anything about that, I mean, we did some organizing before it happened in order to find people to show up. Of course, Peace Corps headquarters was a big source of that. Do you remember anything about that?
I remember a little of it, and I think you put your finger on the fact that in that period of time, because of the Vietnam War and the beginning emergence of the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of fear among returned volunteers that if we tried to do anything, the government would dominate it. And there was, I think there was a lot of suspicion of the Peace Corps agency because of all the political appointees, so that there was a very negative sense that people did not want to be a front for the government's outlook. And one of the arguments of the Iowa group, which by the way, I sort of agree with them now in retrospect, they didn't think the thing should be located, the NPCA should be in Washington because it would become just a typical Washington sort of lobbying type organization. And in some ways it has become that. I mean, when I look at the NPCA, I know there's the point of view that we shouldn't be political and that we should only focus on the Peace Corps, but just being a conventional lobbying organization for the Peace Corps budget to me that doesn't really reflect what our experience should have been. I don't think that's enough of a mission for the experience that 200 and some thousand of it. I mean, surely there was more to it than that. And the NPCA, I go to NPCA events and I'm a little bit turned off by them because they're so
mainstream.
Yes, that's what they want to hobnob so much with people on Capitol Hill and kiss their behinds, that it just sort of.
Now I'm a board member now. I'm finally, signed up to be a board member, and there's a different direction. So you see, two Peace Corps volunteers who don't have the same thing, and I've known Roger all his adult life.
I'm just telling you my feelings. I don't think that we had the experience to become a Washington lobbying organization.
And I agree with you. But just to your point, there was the original Peace Corps group was known as the Return Volunteers Against the War, and it was formed in 1963 when I came back from the Peace Corps, and Jerry Schwinn, and we used to meet in a house on R Street. And to Roger's point, the people that attended, there were Peace Corps volunteers and the FBI. And they took pictures. They took pictures. This has all come out with the Freedom of Information Act things. They took pictures of everybody there, and we were on lists for a long, long time, and that turned a lot of people off. And when you get back, I remember that meeting on Capitol Hill, because people were turned off by this experience. You show up at a meeting and your picture's taken, and you get a file started. And it takes a long time to get a file removed, that's all I can say.
Well, now, historian, you can go to the FBI on a Freedom of Information request.
Yeah, but everything will be marked out in black.
Let me just, I'd say on the other side, there, for a very long time, quote, the Washington establishment was very, very nervous about returned Peace Corps volunteers, and the NPCA in particular, which made it very hard for us to be effective in lots of things. And I will say one thing about the NPCA is it is now respected on Capitol Hill, and I think among the political establishment.
It is or is not?
It is.
It is.
You know, and you have to, there's a trade-off in that. I mean, you have to become mainstream. You have to become mainstream, become respected. But in some ways, it's in a position to be more effective because it is respected. And I think that's a big achievement. But, you know, it all comes down to what you think.
Yeah. I'm recalling too. It is important to work with people and to be, compliant with authorities in some way, because then you do have their ear more. I think I did have like Gaddy's ear, the Peace Corps staff's ear for certain things because of how I and RPCVW in general decided to handle certain issues, because we could have been manipulated by outside sources. One example is the guy who wrote American Taboo about the, and our Peace Corps headquarters was really concerned about it blowing up, and so we didn't.
I don't know what you're talking about.
American Taboo is, there was a volunteer, I think, down in somewhere in the Pacific Islands who was killed, and it was, I don't know how, it wasn't handled well, the investigation, and they tried to blame Peace Corps headquarters, but I think it was more of a local issue, so we didn't give him it was actually my decision. We didn't really give him a forum, and, whereas some RPCVs might have jumped on it and like, yeah, Peace Corps needs to be doing this, and so I just, it's a matter of like working more behind the scenes with delicate issues, and you keep things contained because things do blow up when you have any kind of power or influence over a group or over media. You have to consider the repercussions, and sometimes these kind of conversations are better in private, because I felt I had could trust Peace Corps doing the right thing. So.
Yeah, a couple things. I just sort of want to respond to some of the other things that people have said. And one of them is I definitely agree that it would be helpful if RPCVW had a more diverse board. But that's up to us to be on that board. I mean, I look at the picture, and they're basically looks like younger, recently returned volunteers. But I'm not volunteering to do it. I'm not on it, and that's and other people aren't doing it for a variety of reasons. We just have other things. At one time I was involved, and now I participate a little bit. But that's one thing. The other thing is I want to address the National Peace Corps Associations doing their annual lobbying day. And under Jonathan Pearson, it's really taken off in the last several years. It's going to be this Thursday. I encourage people to participate. What they have accomplished in the past was passage of the Cape Husey Volunteer Protection Act, which is apolitical, but it's to protect volunteers. And my son's a current volunteer, and there are things that go on in his country that are the direct result of the Protection Act. And it's just really, it was important, and I'm glad it got passed. The other thing was more recent was the passage of the Peace Corps commemorative, getting the authorization for a spot for the Peace Corps commemorative. This week, it's going to focus, of course, on budget. That's always number one. But then they're also going to talk about, the other issues are the Equity Act for medical treatment of volunteers to be treated as other foreign and international service professionals. And I forget what it's called, but it's something about allowing Peace Corps RPCVs to use the Peace Corps emblem on obituaries, on tombstones, such as the military. So these are not, partisan. They're political, but they're not partisan. And I think that NPCA is really doing well on that. They have a couple hundred people coming in on the Hill. Jonathan's created packets, talking points. I mean, it's just really well done, and I really appreciate that. So, I mean, I don't know what else they do and what's going on behind the scenes, but I think that's one effort that's really important.
Other questions?
Hi, guys. First, thanks, Jesse, for putting this on. It's amazing. I just want to make sure that you get a round of applause. We're going to give you another one, but I want to get that first one out. Yeah, thank you very much for just the recap of the progress that we're making in Capitol Hill. It's amazing how energetic our community is. I wanted to ask a question kind of about the politics, because I know it's been said that the administration was very wary about Peace Corps volunteers, and particularly Peace Corps volunteers organizing in Washington, D.C. So were any of you all active in 1974 when Peace Corps volunteers did organize, and I believe they occupied the Peace Corps office? Can anyone tell that story when it was? Nobody was here for the.
Well, there was a very radical group of sort of anarchist RPCVs, and they did occupy the building.
Do we want to?
And threw paint in the building. I mean, it was that typical sort of late 60s to early 70s.
Yeah, I guess I just have the news articles to go off of, but for everyone who is not familiar with the story, I believe that a group of RPCVs who were incensed about the war in Southeast Asia occupied the 4th floor of the Peace Corps office, which was at the time in Lafayette Square, I think. So it was in full view of the White House.
Yes, the Myatical building.
Yeah, and apparently they hung a North Vietnamese battle flag out the window. And John Haldeman, I guess, was Nixon's chief of staff, got incensed and was going to.
Jane Fonda moment.
Yes. They were going to send in the National Guard, but the Peace Corps director at the time just put a stop to it, called the media, got them out there, and thankfully we were able to avoid another Kent State kind of situation. But it's kind of fascinating. These stories are out there, and that's why I'm really thankful for Jesse for digging them up and helping us write this history. That's all I've got to say.
Hi there. I wanted to second Chris's thanks to Jesse for putting this on. My name is Josh Johnson. I'm a current board member. I'm on the Professional Development Initiative, and I wanted to first say that this was a very interesting and lively discussion. When I heard history, I thought it might be a little bit dry, but I feel very inspired to hear what you've done, and I feel like it places our board activity in a better context, at least for me. And my question kind of goes back to the diversifying the board and the membership. I think you could technically call it the RPCVW for recently returned. And as my role in the professional development, I try to connect volunteers with jobs and careers, which is difficult when it's a lot of recently returned unemployed people milling about drinking beers. So I wanted to know if you had any suggestions, specific suggestions on how we can create those bridges to members who served previously. Thanks.
One of the problems with things like this is that they tend to build on themselves. Somebody like me who's come to RPCV Washington events for 20, 30 years now, as it's gotten younger, and it's just as I get there, and RPCV Washington was a very important thing for me for a long time. It helped me get started, find my first jobs, and obviously things happen that change, but as I go and I don't know anybody there, and as everybody is much younger, I mean, and wonderful people, please, but what happens is that when you walk into a room where everybody's in their 20s, you sort of wonder, well, is this really the group for me? So I think part of the problem is, even though if nobody is in any way not nice to anybody, these things tend to go in themselves. I have often thought about suggesting sort of not just off the boat group for people, or just something for people who have been out more than 10 years, just to let them know that it's there. I haven't, because I know that the next thing that would be said is, okay, Debbie, run it. And I'm not, and I don't, and I'm not about, and I, given all the other things I'm doing in my life, that's not what I want to do. So there is a little bit of suggesting it or complaining, and yet not doing it. But I do think it's funny, we used to have a recently returned liaison, so that recently returned volunteers would know that they were welcome. And I was one of the few. Now it's kind of the reverse. It's hard to say, because I think people who are out a little bit more are not as interested in just happy hours where you just get 2-for-1 drinks. But not everybody is interested in that anyway. But I think maybe having some kind of a place where you can get a certain critical mass who's been out a little bit longer might help. Of course.
Yeah, even before I got involved with RPCVW, I suggested to NPCA that they should start a mentorship program with the older volunteers and the new recently returned. And so I think, with our economy struggles, which our economy is still very bad. I know many RPCVs who are not working in their field, are working jobs below their qualifications, including some my age. But I think if you guys did a mentoring, career mentoring, there is?
Yeah.
I don't hear about it. I don't. With RPCVW?
Well, MPCA.
I know MPCA recently started something. Well, a few years. Okay. Well, well, not when I was suggesting. You guys act as a conduit.
Send people back there, and then they send people back there. So, but we do have, I believe, 3 mentor coordinators here in DC who get their lists.
And how many people participate in it?
I don't know.
Is it very? But also, and also doing things like this with the history, like with Jesse, and I think is, helps to reach across the eras. So.
My thought is that you should actually go for a little affirmative action on the board. Next time it's time for elections, snare a few geezers and, get them, make it a point ahead of time that the next board is going to have some 20s, some 30s, some 40s, some 50s.
60s and 70s.
And worse. And the other thing, I think, is the nature of the programs. When I look at the list of events, they don't attract me. Or, happy hours with 20-somethings is not what I'd be better off having dinner with my family. And as valuable as the jobs work is, it's not what I'm looking for. So when I remember the issue that we used to have, the speakers, the debates about issues like immigration or problems of the development, now that we have RPCVs who are ambassadors, RPCVW could have something with a wide appeal. Something that would get me up from my house in Rockville and come down here to attend an event because it's dynamite speakers on an interesting topic. And, well, maybe this is it.
We faced a similar question, I think, back in the 80s, and I think membership growth was completely related to the agenda and programming of the organization. And as we've shaped the programming to attract members. The issue forums were a big thing, but we'd have 5 or 6 big things a year that were designed to impactful things, to do stuff that was important, that wasn't. Happy hours are fun, and there's a lot of mixed stuff, but this was on top of that. So I think it's agenda driven. You've got to get an agenda that will drive, that will attract people.
Oh, you want
I'm not, yeah, I'm not so sure that it's a bad thing to have mostly recently returned volunteers, because I think they're the ones that really need the connections. As Debbie pointed out, I had the same experience when I came, when I COS'd. Going into Peace Corps is great. You go with your training group and you're all together, but then when you leave, you all disperse. And you come back and no one understands what you've gone through and what the experience has been, but other Peace Corps volunteers, regardless of where they've served. And so when I came back before I went to graduate school, I was just floating around, and having RPCVW was amazing, but there weren't a lot of recently returned volunteers. Now that I've been out for many years and I've established and have other connections, it's not as critical an organization for me. On the other hand, I can offer things to recently returned volunteers. I have 2 positions I've got to fill, and I would love to fill them with a non-competitive status, but the problem is that they have the same problem that I had, and that it's very hard to quantify your Peace Corps volunteer service to fit in for you to get your pegs into the holes of a government position. It's incredibly difficult, and but you know, I'm on the other side right now, and I would love to hire at least one non-competitive status.
Well, let me know. I will post it, and I would love to fill it with an RPCVD.
But the problem is I have to get someone who's got the qualifications. That's the problem. Yeah.
I've long been saying, with schmoozing year after year with whoever I know on the board, that the issue forums, you've got great people around Washington who are more than willing to do it. Maybe one possibility would be to partner with American University, who seems to, this is my 3rd event here, this week at AU related to Peace Corps related things. I'm president of my Friends of group, Bolivia and Peru. That would draw me. The other thing, though, is it's not going to be so easy, because now that you've got, it never would occur to me not to pay $15 to RPCVW, even if I don't attend anything during the year. I used to attend, without fail, the summer annual meetings when they were held at the Yacht Club, which is a great place, and I know why you're not there now. But it might be the possibility to have events, but also maybe at AU, which would draw a lot of people. GW would be another possibility. I go to things at GW related to their Latin American program there. But when I looked on the directory and went through the whole directory of who are members of RPCVW paying their, and I think it says what year they were volunteers. I mean, that also is an issue, that the older people who, like a Roger would be, like a B.J. Warren as an example, who's a friend of mine, people who are dyed-in-the-wool Peace Corps, returned Peace Corps volunteers, are not on the list as paying their dues, even $15. And I'm not saying Roger, I'm sure Roger has paid his dues, but I'm just saying I went through and looked at people who are members of my organization, my Friends of group, and who are, I send emails out 3 or 4 times a week about, to everybody I know about events going on in Washington having to do with Bolivia and Peru, which there seem to be a lot of these days. But that is going to be a problem, because they're not, I don't know if you'll need money, but if you need money, that's an untapped source. The other thing is that I'm on the mentoring program. I'm the mentoring coordinator for my Bolivia and Peru. And the people want to find jobs, and then once they find jobs, thanks to Josh, who runs really high quality programming, I've attended a few, they're gone. I mean, there's the social stuff, but mostly it's to connect and find jobs. And when they come asking for mentoring, through the NPCA, the program that they have, I'm a psychologist, so I want someone who's having problems with their readjustment. They really are. They don't know it, and eventually I'll get to it. I'll pull it out of them. but mostly it is find me a job, you know. And I want to be a Peace Corps volunteer with money. Is basic. I want to get a good salary and be a Peace Corps volunteer is essentially what it is.
I think that presents an option that hasn't been mentioned, which is more, I think the friends of groups in the area may have an older constituency.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
joint programs.
Yes.
You know, something.
Good idea.
And another thing that might attract people is movie screenings. That we had movies, one summer, we had a series of 4 women in development movies, I think. And it was a very memorable program, very well done. That might bring out people of a lot of different ages.
All right.
Another thing is embassies, and I'm friends with the people at the Peruvian embassy. The Bolivians won't talk to us because we're spies, but the Peruvian embassy, and we have Passport DC will be going on May 5th, I think. I've got it written down on my calendar, where embassies all over town have open houses. And we go and help them, you know, crowd control and hand out free pisco sour and all that. We also help, there are, the National Museum of American Indians has festivals, cultural festivals. And we 2 years ago, I mounted 99 translators, you know, from our group and other South American countries, RPCVs. And these are opportunities that volunteers love, you know, translating for artisans, you know, who speak no English and help them sell their things and all. We help out in elections when they have to have, you know, on-site elections and you're required to vote and they come from Tennessee and Delaware. You know, we mount, you know, 80 return volunteers to help them keep crowd control and count ballots and all of that stuff.
That's good to know. Yeah, we are actually trying to restart the embassy events again, seeing that as a joint thing. It's sort of a bit of stop and go and whatnot, but it is something that we're trying to reach out to as a way to help diversify the interests of who might want to attend our events.
Jesse, in addition to thanking you for this event and doing the history project, I was very happy when I saw that RPCVW played such a big role and a helpful role for the 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
Guiding people around and stuff. People like myself really appreciate seeing you do that. And when I was invited to this, I looked up the website, and I didn't know all this was going on. I was very thrilled to see that RPCVW is still such a dynamic organization. So I think you just should advertise it a lot because it is appreciated. And one other thing that I want to make a plug for in terms of program and agenda, the AmeriCorps and the idea of national service, non-military national service, is in a direct line of descent from the Peace Corps. If you were very involved in the whole development of the legislation for AmeriCorps and the Corporation for National Service, you will know that it was in a direct line of descent from the Shriver era of the Peace Corps and the invention of that. And I have always felt that our returned Peace Corps volunteers, our RPCVW, the NPCA, should be among the most powerful advocates for non-military national service and in support of AmeriCorps, the Corporation for National Service, and its expansion to reach as many Americans as possible and involve them in community service. And yet, if you are involved with the corporation, as I am, there isn't a Peace Corps presence really in that, or a sense of linkage between the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps, the Corporation for National Service. There should be. I mean, it's all about the same thing, which is getting Americans involved in national and community service. So I would urge you to make a high item on your agenda for the future is finding a way to be advocates for and supporters of AmeriCorps and the Corporation for National Service. It's got a lot of growth that it could do, and it needs your support. Because the same way that some people are always after cutting the Peace Corps budget. They're always trying to undo the Corporation for National Service too, so it needs all the help it can get. It should be as important to you as the Peace Corps is.
Okay, thank you very much. I realize our time is over at this point. We've gone over a little bit, but I think if people want to still connect up at this point and have a little bit more of a conversations, we can still do that. But I think, I don't know.
Thank you, Jesse.